Welcome to Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Jude Russo and Joseph Addington. Today we'll be talking about the troubled waters that Republicans find themselves in 1 week after state and local elections dominated by the Democratic Party. Attention has turned to the affordability crisis in recent days, as political analysts believe that was the main issue or one of the main issues that boosted Democrats last week. President Trump has bristled at concerns about affordability, saying costs are coming down under his leadership, even as he inherited a bad economy from Biden. But he's also clearly keen to address the issue. Over the weekend, he directed the Department of Justice to investigate foreign meatpacking companies for price fixing. He floated giving Americans a dividend of at least $2,000 drawn from tariff revenue, and he proposed 50-year mortgages to lower the monthly cost of mortgage payments. NPR wrote this week that the average homebuyer's age is 59 and the average first time buyer is 40, which is an all time high. We've also seen some other troubling economic data, including about declining voter perception of how well the economy is doing. Jude, what's your read on the politics of affordability and Trump's moves on this issue as we head into a midterm election year?
Well, I think it's a real problem. I think that controversially, when your voters say that something is a problem, even if it doesn't seem substantial, it is per se a problem. If people are unhappy about something, it doesn't matter how unimportant you think it is. That is a problem for you. That said, there are objective distortions, bad things we're seeing in the economy. Uh, Housing continues to be the particular crux of people's aggravation with the economy. Um, this is not going to go away, especially if we need to keep interest rates steady to fight inflation in other sectors. So I do think that there are real problems there. I think that the flurry of activity and announced policies were coming out of the White House is pretty typical. These are band aid fixes. They're very flashy. They're things that uh, maybe we can get through quickly or maybe we can't. It's not looking towards the actual secular trends that are driving this problem, which, as I see it, are relatively few in number, but very gnarly to deal with. We do still have a distortion in the money supply from the COVID era. Growth has caught up some with the amount that we expanded the money supply, but there's still a lot of fat splashing around. Um, we have not really endured a correction for the bazooka of cash we pointed at the American people during the COVID crisis. So that's something that's difficult to deal with. Obviously, the way that you deal with that is by raising interest rates or raising taxes. I know that somebody listening to this is going to write me a nasty email saying that taxes are not actually a tool for fighting inflation. To which I would say, no, it is literally a way to take money out of the money supply. It may not be a very palatable way to fight inflation, but it is a way to fight inflation. Uh, it is one avenue, however, that is closed to Republicans, which Grover Norquist never said anything truer than when he said that the Republican Party exists to cut taxes. And raising interest rates or even keeping interest rates steady is also unpopular, especially because that affects mortgage rates. And so much of the frustration is centered on housing right now. So that is, I think, the first secular driver that we're looking at. The second secular driver that we're looking at is the regulation problem. It's very difficult to build stuff. The reason that we have a very limited housing stock supply is that in parts of the country that are growing because they have jobs and economic activity that attract people, it's very difficult to build. And this was sort of the great part of the great wasted promise of the Doge mania back at the beginning of the administration. Uh, Doge came in and, reducing federal headcount was part of the mandate. But the other part of the mandate was massively cutting down on the regulation that gets in the way of various industries at the federal level, particularly energy regulation, which does affect housing significantly, but also affects every other economic sector. When Vivek left Doge in the early days to go run for governor of Ohio, that left Elon. Elon really wasn't terribly concerned about regulation. This may be because some of his companies do very well on rent seeking based on the way that the regulatory regime is set up right now. May just be that he's not that interested in it. And so the regulatory part fell away even as we were doing this sort of headcount reduction mania, which, itself may or may not have stuck, may or may not have improved government efficiency. So these are sort of the two really big poles of the economic problem right now that we're sort of orbiting. And throwing more cash into the economy by, $2,000 tariff revenue bribes is not going to help with the money supply issue. That's just going to aggravate the problem, even if it is pretty vigorously means tested. The version that I saw is that nobody making over 100 grand is going to get a payoff. So that, it'll make people happy in the short term, but it will not actually help with any of the problems in the long term. The analog here is the Bishop pump in the 70s in the UK, where the conservative government ran the economy very, very hot, poured a lot of money into the money supply, helped with unemployment a great deal, made people's paychecks go up, but did also further aggravate the inflation issues they were already having with the sterling. So, yeah, maybe it's a short term political win. I don't see it as something that's going to solve the problem in the long run. Similarly, the 50-year mortgage thing does not, to me, seem like it's something that we can do now. It can be implemented quickly. We don't need to really mess around with Congress about it. But I think that part of the reason that 30-year mortgage works and shorter terms of mortgage work is that there is an imaginable time scale on which you will actually own your house. And the amount that you put into it when you include the interest will conceivably be matched at some point by the rising value of the house. Uh, on 50 years, that basic arithmetic, I think, stops working for people. And while the American people are not necessarily, uh, they're not all going to the math Olympics or anything, I think that they know when they're looking at their checkbook and they're looking at the rate at which their salaries are increasing. They know when they're being sold a bill of goods. So I'm not too optimistic about the 50-year mortgage as being a band-aid for the problem, especially since the fundamental issue is a constriction in the supply. There are not enough houses in America. It doesn't matter how many financing options you have for American housing stock if people just aren't building more houses. And in fact, the more financing options you throw at a constricted supply is subsidizing demand. It is going to make the prices go up. So I think that this is sort of a bad fix. On the other hand, what are the other options? What else can you do to relieve this pressure point for the American people? Um, I mean, I think that that is a good question for which I don't have answers. Obviously, I'd like to see somebody swinging through at the federal level and also at state houses, cutting regulation on building. But that's easy to say, very difficult actually to implement. And this is an administration that has not shown the appetite or the ability to execute plans that have a longer maturation cycle than about a week. So I'm not I'm not convinced that anything that's been floated so far is going to help the problem, but I'm also not convinced that anything that would actually address the issues is coming down the pike either.
Yeah, with the 50-year mortgage, it seems like Americans, as you say, kind of intuitively recognize that the arithmetic on that wouldn't match, wouldn't really add up for them building up equity. But they definitely, can recognize that they'll be dead, before they actually end up buying the home. They're basically just kind of glorified renters who have to fix everything that goes wrong in their house rather than a landlord doing it. So that seems to have gotten some pushback. Laura Ingraham interviewed Donald Trump recently. That's been coming out in the past day, I think. I don't know if it was yesterday that she interviewed him, but it was recent. She mentioned the 50-year mortgage thing. She mentioned that it got some pushback from MAGA. I'm not sure who exactly she was thinking about. And actually, this ended up being maybe the most adversarial Fox News interview of Trump that I can remember seeing in a very long time. Not that I watched every single one, but it was kind of striking for how willing Ingram was to kind of linger on topics, especially economics topics that are awkward for Trump right now, to give pushback to Trump after he answered in a way that she thought was evasive. It was quite interesting to watch. Joseph, when I mentioned the possibility of us talking about that interview, you seemed very keen to do so. So we can talk about one part of the interview where he's talking about bringing 600,000 Chinese students in for American universities, but sticking to the economics topics that were raised in that interview, so affordability mainly. What stood out to you about the Laura Ingraham interview, and why did you want to talk about it?
Sure, I thought there were several points in the interview that were particularly interesting. The first and most pertinent is, uh, Laura Ingraham essentially told Trump that a lot of voters feel like the economy is not doing well for them, and that affordability is a problem. And he essentially said, "Nah, like they're wrong. We have the greatest economy ever, and you should be thankful to me for it." And that seemed a rather dangerous sort of perspective to for the president to take, given that
It
the
works so well for
Republicans did
Biden.
very poorly in the recent election, and voters aren't happy when politicians dismiss their concerns. So that seemed like an obvious problem. Uh, then there were two other things. The first one was the president again floated this idea of bringing in significantly more, about double the amount of Chinese, essentially foreign students that we currently have. We've got, I think, about 300,000 in the United States now. President was talking about bringing in some 600,000. The argument was that this would help the American university system and prevent some half of universities from going out of business, especially the president mentioned historical black colleges. There are a lot of problems, I think, with bringing in Chinese foreign students to the United
It's such
States
a funny example for him to pick because it's
on
like the one
national
school where
security
Chinese students
matters,
are
but
not going to.
yeah, I also don't think it will really help HBCUs. But I mean, I do think it's interesting that the president, even in his first term, Trump put quite a bit of money into HBCUs as well. So obviously he thinks that there's some value there. Probably he hopes that it will, he's been working on. We hear about the multiracial coalition, which you wrote about. I think this is one area where Trump thinks that he can, perhaps get credit among voters in that demographic. The other thing that was making a big deal is the discussion of immigration and H-1B visas. Trump said that the United States needs foreign talent, and Laura Ingraham pushed back pretty thoroughly on that, and said, we have talent here at home. And Trump said, we don't have at least enough talent or the right talent. Um, and that, at least, I think, has been making a really big deal among the Trump base online. So people have been very mad about his comments over the H-1B visas. So, in general, I think it was a pretty revealing interview, especially for how oppositional it was. And I think you're going to start to see some really big pushback from Trump voters and Trump supporters, even on the base, that feel like domestic issues have been really badly handled. Um, the border is secure, but a lot of the other issues that are of importance to the base have really not been done very well. So I think that this could be a really big problem going into 2026. The midterms are an off election. Trump is not going to be on the ballot. Republicans are going to be relying on voter enthusiasm because they have now a lower propensity voter base than Democratic voters. And if the base is not happy with the Trump administration, then it could be a real bloodbath.
Yeah, that's the concern, and obviously that was the concern from last week. You know, a lot of people, and I guess this is kind of the line being pushed on conservative news, conservative television, that these were just blue states: New Jersey, Virginia, California, New York. So who cares if the Democrats won? I don't think that's how Republican insiders are viewing the election results because the margins were clearly very concerning. Democrats were winning by larger margins than they should have, even in California, like blue California, this measure that they had to let the dominated legislature draw redistricting maps. That wasn't popular among Californians initially. They took pride in that independent commission that was drawing maps previously. But Newsom was pretty easily able to get them in this like resistance mindset. So that was probably the election that was the least surprising or concerning. But even there, it shows a kind of mood shift in the country among Democrats. They're kind of getting their mojo back, and Republicans seem like the opposite is happening. On this Laura Ingraham interview, I actually think okay, so the one where he said we need to bring in the Chinese students to help historically black colleges, that was the funniest moment I thought because it was just kind of weird. But when I actually think that the reaction is a little unfair on this H1B issue thing because for whatever reason he was thinking about this particular factory in Georgia
The
that
Korea, the
right.
South Korean factory raid, yes.
Yeah, so they're making batteries at this plant. For those who don't know, China is like the world leader. They're kicking our butts in EV batteries and in EV generally. And some people looking ahead to like the coming new technology economy, they think that America needs to make these indigenously so we don't get left behind. But we don't really have that manufacturing know-how anymore. So under the Biden administration, I believe we brought in South Korean engineers to kind of get that plant up and running, and they were supposed to be working here on a temporary basis. There was some sort of ICE raid. Perhaps without the knowledge of Trump, he gave that impression that he was upset about it or this is not something he would have approved. But these South Koreans ended up leaving like in handcuffs. And I think they were really surprised because they were here to like train American workers. So I don't think he was saying, Americans can't possibly be trained to do this kind of job. He was just saying they need to be trained by non-Americans because we don't have this manufacturing know-how at the moment. And obviously, some of his answer was very poorly worded when he's saying, "No, you don't have the talent," right? He was clearly frustrated. I think knocked off balance a little bit by perhaps this unexpectedly adversarial line of questioning that he was getting on Fox News. But the general answer showed a kind of pragmatism that I don't think is terrible. Jude, I know you're loath to watch television, but did you get a chance to watch this interview, and what did you think?
Um, Even if I didn't, I saw enough of it that I can pretend. I will say though that in fairness to the people who are mad about this, uh, the H-1B program is not actually a tool that is particularly well suited to this purpose. And in fact, I would be surprised if those South Koreans were here on H-1B visas. I
Yeah.
think that the visa category for technical specialists at that level is like an O visa.
Mhm.
Um, H-1B visas specifically are for people who are just working uh, like mid and low senior level technical jobs. These are not it's not a program that is oriented towards the best and brightest, which is what everybody's trying to make it about. It's towards, people who graduated and have some amount of engineering experience to come and just do regular engineering jobs. And the way that the administration has handled this program uh, is frankly weird and kind of piratical. Uh, Instead of eliminating the lottery system or reforming the lottery system, uh, which would deal with these bad actors who push through tons and tons of unqualified H-1B recipients to American companies, which is a real actual pain point in Silicon Valley, right? Silicon Valley does not want to turn off the H-1B program because they do, in fact, like having cheap labor. Um, but it's very frustrating if you're a hiring manager and you get uh, somebody who on paper is qualified for the job, but then it turns out they've been pushed through one of these mills. I saw from somebody working in the industry, I don't know whether this is a true number, but he says 1 in 10 of the H-1Bs he's getting is actually up to the work that's being presented. And then the other 9 are just bugging the one guy to help them with their work every 20 minutes. Uh, so instead of trying to address this problem of the H-1B mills by doing some reform to the lottery system, the administration decided to throw $100,000 fee to the hiring companies on H-1Bs, uh, which just sort of looks like a shakedown. It seems very much in line with other administration policies, which seem to arise from a get-rich-quick philosophy. Um, so I think that, you know, yes, the South Korean thing, I think that Trump is on firm ground about the actual substance of it, which is we do not have this knowledge base for battery manufacturing in America. We are going to need to import some talent. Same with chips. When we built the semiconductor manufacturing in Arizona, there was a big fight with the unions because TSMC wanted to bring in engineers from Taiwan to get this place up and running. And they said, look, there just is not a base here of people who have the particular training to get this done. We are going to bring over 250 Taiwanese. They are going to get the place up and running, and then we'll send them back. And maybe that's good faith, maybe that's bad faith, but I do think that there is a real argument to be made there. That's not what the H-1B program is about, and that's what we're talking about here. H-1B program is about supplementing lacks in normal technical jobs. And there's a lot of other stuff that gets grandfathered in too. If you actually look at the schedule that was released with that to go along with the announcement of the $100,000 fee. I think that there's a conflation of two things that's going on here. And it does not help the administration to pretend that the guys in South Korea are the same thing as the H-1Bs.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you about the H-1B visa program. It's clearly some sort of scam, largely. I think that the idea of this $100,000 fee, I mean, it kind of makes sense to me. I would need to look into it more, but the idea, as I understand it, is rather than getting a discount for hiring a foreign worker, you pay a premium to do so. So you better vet them carefully. And you're probably only going to bring in the ones that you genuinely need now. But I'd be fine if we just eliminated this visa category entirely, at least for a period of time.
The
Um,
premium really makes very little difference because it's a one-time fee assessed to a company, and so especially for the body shops that are the major problem, it's it's $100,000 for as many H-1B visas
well,
as you're gonna hire. If
yeah,
you're bringing in thousands, well,
right. But that whole thing, I mean, one of the things that was annoying about that discourse is it sounded really good at first. And I think even Lutnick or somebody high up in the administration made it seem like it was for every single
for
hired
every
worker,
single worker.
and then it would be retroactively applied to existing people on an existing H-1B visa contract, which is like 3 years, I think.
But then it turned
But it
out
turns out
Lutnick
that
was
wasn't
telling
true
tales out
either.
of school as
Yeah.
usual.
So yeah,
He says a
what it
lot of
got
stuff.
watered down to was crap. I agree with that. So affordability is interesting because I think most people generally, when they hear that word, they think about high prices because inflation is such a salient issue, but it also pertains to wages. And Laura Ingraham, I believe at one point was saying, "Well, how is it helping with wages to bring all these H-1Bs here?" And I'm just kind of curious, Joseph. Jude raised the issue earlier of like what is politically possible for the Republican Party to even do to address the affordability crisis. It seems like some people are thinking about immigration in this context. I actually have a little bit of a pet peeve when people talk about immigration and the harms of immigration in economics terms, because I think that the data is a bit more ambiguous on whether it's good for the economy. My opposition to mass immigration has more to do with like cultural cohesion, right? And I'm willing to still oppose mass migration, even if it turns out it's like slightly good for wages and obviously good for overall GDP. But Joseph, how do you think immigration fits into affordability? And generally, what do you think the GOP should pursue policy wise to address this issue that clearly voters care a lot about?
Sure. So first of all, I think as far as immigration's effect on housing, it's relatively obvious. You can look at especially a country like Canada, which has imported massive amounts of essentially temporary workers with a very limited housing stock and limited ability to expand their housing stock, and it has absolutely driven Canadian housing prices through the roof. So I think that the effect of immigration on housing and other goods of similarly limited or fixed supply is obviously negative. As far as its impact on wages, it's a little bit more complicated. Immigrants do also consume, and so they increase the demand for general goods in circulation, as well as, acting as a increase in the supply of labor. So they increase demand for labor as well as supply. Uh, the question is always, how does that actually affect the American worker? There's a lot, there's some evidence that the benefits from immigration tend to accrue to capital owners, essentially, people who employ other people as opposed to workers themselves. So, yes, it will increase the economy generally, but it probably won't benefit the American worker, even if it doesn't necessarily harm them a lot. I do think the major problems of immigration are essentially cultural, and that has obviously real economic effects. Like, culture affects how the economy runs, it affects what kinds of policies the population is interested in voting for, what kinds of policies are palatable or possible. So I don't think that I think that economists are very unwise to dismiss the cultural effect of immigration and its impact on the economy. Um, but I don't think that certainly the effects of immigration on wages are as clear cut as some people would like to say. In the short term, though, I think it's pretty obvious that immigration does increase competition for wages, or competition for labor, and drive down wages within specific tech sectors. So it can definitely be a pain point. That's why Silicon Valley likes H-1B visas, because it does decrease their labor costs. So, uh, for specific sectors and groups of voters, immigration is definitely a problem as far as their wages go. But I think the bigger sort of issue as far as immigration goes really is more on the cultural side and the general cohesive sense of the nation. Uh, but I also don't think that it's really I also don't think that the Trump administration in general has handled sort of a lot of the H-1B visas seriously. It's been a major problem continuously for the administration that the base is really opposed to H-1B visas. But it seems like especially the tech donors, which Trump has been getting closer to during his second administration, certainly than his first, are very unhappy with that. And I think that those relations are really complicating matters between the base and the administration on this issue.
Yeah, I want to move on now to a different part of this sea of troubled waters that Republicans presently find themselves in. We talked a little bit about this topic last week, Joseph, with Samantra about this Tucker Carlson interview with Nick Fuentes, this far right figure. The followers of Fuentes are called Groypers. Um, Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, released a video statement defending Tucker Carlson, although he also said he abhorred Nick Fuentes' views. The backlash was intense. Heritage Foundation has been under a lot of pressure. There's been a kind of continuous struggle session that Roberts has been under since then. And this whole discourse has evolved a bit in recent days. You know, at one point, it seemed like the main thing going on was, people, pro-Israel types were trying to use this as an opportunity to tie anti-interventionism to anti-Semitism. There obviously also was, in addition to that, some genuine concern about rising anti-Semitism on the right. And in the past few days, we've seen a more general effort to kind of settle scores, and use this as an opportunity to gatekeep, right? So David French of the New York Times has been one of the people doing this. Some former a president and chairman or something of the Heritage Foundation released a post on X doing the same thing, and these people
It was
are
of
condemning.
ISI.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's what I meant. Thank you for the correction. Um, and both those people and French were condemning the so-called post-liberals. And this would include, I think French definitely has in mind Sowora Bakmari because they've beefed in the past. Patrick Deneen was mentioned in that post by the former ISI people. That's the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. It does work on college campuses, kind of keeping alive interest in the Western canon and conservative thought. Um, and
And they sponsor
this,
lots of conservative journalists, including yours truly.
right. Um, so I'm curious to kind of get your feedback from both of you. Like, do you think that that campaign to sideline these so-called post-liberals is working? I have something to say about that, definitely. Or do you think that the backlash to these most recent posts was loud enough to where it's not going to work? What do you think, Jude?
I think that it's important to identify two distinct threads in what's happening here. So there is a thread of specifically pro-Israel conservatives who want to purge Israel skepticism from the movement. They don't necessarily have tons of institutional investment. They're not like looking for particular teams to win. It's just that, they believe in a certain set of priors, and they're trying to advance those within the coalition. And so they're going after uh, people that they see as deviating from those. And once the dust settles, assuming that they've won as much as they want, it's business as usual. Um, a different set of interests is that of the old conservative fusionist establishment, which got really sort of blown to hell and back by the ascent of Trump. So this is National Review specifically is sort of the center of this stuff. But there are other institutions of similar orientation. Heritage, and a lot of the old line heritage people who were there before Roberts was of this persuasion as well. And what they are doing is they are trying to use the campaign of the former not just to purge Israel skepticism specifically from the movement, but to reestablish themselves as the preeminent gatekeepers for conservative orthodoxy. They're trying to regain their prior position. And so, to some degree, the Israel stuff for them is purely instrumental. They're not, they may in fact be pro-Israel or Israel skeptical, but mostly they are interested in reestablishing themselves as the main characters of the conservative movement in America. And so I think that when you see the stuff that's going on at ISI, uh, it's frankly silly. It's very tenuously attached to any of the legitimate anti-Semitism concerns or the concerns about conservatives going soft on Israel. It's complaining about NatCon affiliated people is very silly. There is a very strong pro-Israel streak among the national conservatives. So it's just that this is now about consolidating institutional power rather than any particular ideological fight. And part of this is the muscle memory of the way fusionism became preeminent the first time. Bill Buckley conducted a purge of all the losers and weirdos. So anti-Semites, the Birch Society, the remnants of the American Mercury. And that's how National Review ended up as the organ of conservatism in America for a period pretty much unchallenged, for a period of about 60 years. So they are trying to do that again. I think that is unlikely to work. I think that the environment is very different from the mid 60s. I think that there's too much turmoil and there's too much relative parity and strength between these different factions for them to be able to reassert themselves this way again. I also think that on the actual sort of prima facie issue, which is Israel skepticism, I think that because of demographic changes, there is real. I don't think that using that as a tool is a slam dunk the way that it was even 30 years ago. I mean, even among Israeli conservatives, there is this sense that the change in American public opinion is a major problem. I believe that Netanyahu himself gave a speech some months ago where he floated the idea of a detox from American aid after this round of campaigns is wrapped up. So I think that it's both a losing instrument, and I think that it's a losing cause. I don't think that the conditions there for a purge of, anodyne figures like Johnny Burtka is really in the cards.
Mhm. Joseph, what's your read?
Sure. I think there's a few things that are going on. First of all is I think that pretty much everybody can smell blood in the water on the right now. The Trump administration is doing poorly on domestic issues. We suffered a loss of an election in a way that was surprising to a lot of people on the right. We lost Charlie Kirk, who was a major unifying figure for the right institutionally, and had access to a lot of sort of the levers that he could pull to bring these various strands together and help them to coordinate. Um, and of course, we have the blow up over Fuentes, which is being exploited by a number of strands on the right and also by the mainstream left, which wants to tar sort of the right generally with Groyperism, anti Semitism, whatever you want, whatever invectives you want to attach to Nick Fuentes, which is why he's been in the New York Times a bunch lately, getting sort of the Richard Spencer treatment, as it were. Um, and so, I think that the old sort of movement conservatism rightfully sees this and says, if there's a moment to try to reassert fusionism as the center of the American conservative movement, the American right, this is the moment to go for it. I also think they're going to fail miserably simply because they no longer have the same kind of cachet, they no longer have the same amount of human capital, and the media and political situation is so incredibly different. Uh, the internet and social media did not exist when Buckley purged the Berkshires. This is not something that the National Review can go through and fire people from their publishing staff and assume that they are going to be shut up. They will just go online and publish their own thing. And so you can't control you can't control the acceptable public opinion in that way anymore. This is something that the mainstream left has struggled with, and now it's something that the mainstream right is dealing with. And even sort of the more far fringes of the right, if you can see Fuentes as sort of an expression of the same problem. There's not a way to exclude people from discourse on the internet. They are going to say what they want to say. People are going to listen to them if they want to listen to them. And political movements are going to have to figure out how to deal with that.
Mhm.
So, but also in general, if you want to compare Buckley and the kind of people that make up sort of the remnants of the fusionist conservatives today, they're not very impressive, frankly. And you can sort of you can see a real decline in the quality of the movement. These are people that want to respond to new issues and new problems by quoting Reagan speeches to the flames. They don't take the concerns that animated the sort of populist rise seriously. They assume that by dismissing or ostracizing people, they can somehow make social conditions change in ways that are favorable to them. It's just not a serious attempt. And so you can see it by the attempt to do silly things like, yeah, purge Johnny Burtka, who is not controversial, purge Patrick Deneen, who Barack Obama recommended on his reading list. Um, it's not like, Patrick Deneen is not Nick Fuentes. There's no real question about sort of the acceptability. It's just an attempt to to marginalize all kinds of intellectual ideas that they don't like. And it's a very anti-intellectual in a way that notably Buckley actually was not. Especially if you look at the early National Review. The National Review was drawing on some pretty radical streams of American conservative thought. Russell Kirk was going with the uh, Southern agrarians. There were all kinds of
James
sort of
Burnham.
yeah, exactly. Burnham,
Mhm.
the managerial revolution. Uh, I've heard some people suggest that he was a lot more like Curtis Yarvin than some people would be comfortable with admitting. Um, so there are all kinds of, in many ways, it just seems like the old fusionist conservatism is exhausted and has become anti-intellectual and is afraid of engaging with the new ideas and unable to reckon with the political situation of the time. So I don't think there's
I'd
anything
also
material.
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I I take this as essentially the last gasp. This is sort of the final embers of the institutional power of what was left of movement conservatism attempting to reassert themselves. And the very the very fact that this has to happen kind of shows the inherent weakness of the whatever is left of fusionist conservatism.
I think it shows a failure to actually learn the lessons, right? The gold-plated lesson of the Trump era is that political tendencies and discursive tendencies you don't like, if you just suppress them, are not going to go away. They're going to burst out in unwelcome, unexpected ways eventually, which is, why we have discursive turmoil on the right now. It's why the fusionists are no longer the only game in town. I think that this is why I am not a fan of Fuentes, but if you just ignore him, don't invite him on your stuff, all of this is, if you don't engage with the actual ideas, um, they're just going to stay out there in the fever swamps and fester and build up strength. And you are not going to like the form in which they come out when they do come out. So I think that, the fusionists didn't learn that, if you suppress Buchananism for 30 years, well, a guy is actually someday going to come out and win on a Buchananite platform, although he may not govern on one. And he's not going to really like you very much. And he's going to spend a lot of time dismembering your institutions and sidelining them. So I think that even if they were to be successful tactically, which, as I said, I'm very doubtful that they will be successful tactically, strategically, the problem doesn't go away. History seems to suggest that the problem will just be much worse down the road.
Speaking of Fuentes, this might be a good time to talk very briefly about Rod Dreher's missive. Is that something that you were wanted to bring up, Andrew, I believe?
Yeah, let me just say on this whole thing, the conversation you were just having, I want to amplify something that you said, Joseph. This post by these former ISI bigwigs, it was going after Johnny Birdka of ISI, who you two have both mentioned, and the post condemned him for hosting a
Whom, for
conversation
for
with
full disclosure, was executive director of the American
right,
Conservative for a few years.
and that post mentioned the American Conservative,
He called us
in that
both liberal.
context. Yeah,
Which
well,
I
I thought
resent. I'm very thoroughly liberal. So
it so it condemned him for hosting a conversation at ISI with Patrick Deneen and Curtis Yarvin, and as you mentioned, Joseph, I mean, Barack Obama recommended this book, Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deneen, and Curtis Yarvin went on a New York Times podcast. Um, people
profiled in
used
the
to
New
say
Yorker.
yeah, people used to say that we shouldn't let liberals, set the parameters of acceptable conservative discourse. And now it seems like this kind of fusionist backlash is trying to set those parameters more tightly than the liberals do, which is extremely irritating. And yeah, we can talk briefly about this Rod Dreher piece. He was in DC recently. He met with JD Vance apparently, and he talked to Vance about Dreher's concerns about Groyperism. about how Groyperism threatens the country and the party, and also JD Vance personally. For those who don't know, Nick Fuentes like despises JD Vance. He hates him, and he's trying to, um, I guess, attack him in a way that'll make it less likely that JD Vance will become president one day. Dre Hair doesn't say what Vance's response was, but Dre Hair, it's a pretty long post. I'll be honest. I eventually started skimming, but the theme of the post is like what I learned during my long weekend in DC, and he reiterates his claim that 30 to 40% of ZoomerCon staffers on Capitol Hill listen to Fuentes. He seems extremely concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism on the right and the growing power of Nick Fuentes. So that's just some throat clearing to kind of establish the context. But it sounds, Joseph, like you wanted to make a kind of comment on this piece by Dreher.
Sure, because it sort of builds into what or feeds into what Jude was talking about about the sort of suppression of discourse. Is I thought it was really notable because Dreher talks about the various problems that he sees with corporism. Uh, First of all, the notion that 40% of Capitol Hill staffers, Republican Capitol Hill staffers, are fans of Nick Fuentes is slanderous. It's ludicrous. There is no way that that is anywhere close to reality. So I'm honestly a little bit offended that he continues to bandy about this idea, because it is really outside of. It's really disrespectful in many ways, and it's not at all correct.
And that you're basing that on because you're a young man in DC, so but that's based on your own conversations with people in your age cohort, your generation.
Yes.
Mhm.
And I'm actually working on a piece on something related to this as well right now. So hopefully that will come out if I'm able to get more information. Won't be scientific, but it'll give a better understanding of the idea. Um, but I also do think that it's interesting that essentially Dreher goes through and he lists a lot of the reasons fairly accurately. I think that he sees that young men are frustrated with essentially the state of the right and why they've turned towards figures like Nick Fuentes. Talks about how they've been brought up, in a society is that has identity carve outs for every group except white men, that talks down to them, that explicitly discriminates against them, and that also shows various problems with sort of their material well-being. It's difficult for them to get a good job out of college. If you look at this, ties a little bit back to affordability, but the job market, especially for young college grads, is abysmal. Um, Housing prices put the prospect of ever owning a home out of a lot of people, out of reach of a lot of people. The dating market for young people is terrible. So a lot of these people, a lot of these young men feel like they'll never have the kind of sort of the very basic building blocks of a good life that sort of everyone expected in America forever to be able to be
What's
married, have a
terrible
family,
about the
have a
dating
job,
market?
own a house.
What's terrible about the dating market? I'm curious.
Well,
It's a
there's a
little
lot, and
Korean, Andrew.
it's difficult. I can't speak too much of it because I'm entirely in my own subculture, which is very different. But I know that there are a lot of people that have major problems, and I think a lot of that is because of a combination of dating apps and other general social trends. Um, it's not all the same among Latter-day Saints. We have our kind of our own thing.
Also, just frankly, if your economic prospects are bad as a man, your dating prospects are bad.
Yes, very much so, and more so because women don't like to date men that are lower status than them. So privileging women tends to be destructive towards the male dating market generally. Um, and that is currently essentially how our society functions. Uh, but then Dreher goes on to talk about essentially how these, he talks about how these concerns are real, and then he offers nothing whatsoever as to how the right should address young men. Instead, he spends like the remaining 2/3 of the piece talking about anti-Semitism and how the United States needs to work on reducing anti-Semitism and protecting the Jews and so forth, things like that. Um, Goes into a lot of concrete policy issues. Goes into more concrete detail there. And so, it's kind of revealing to me that even where we can accurately identify these problems, there's not a lot of appetite on the right for people who want to do things like confront raperism to actually take young men seriously. It's like, well, we recognize that you have these problems. Well, that's great. What are you actually going to do about it? There's very little appetite for taking young men seriously in a way that pretty much everybody takes any other identity group seriously. And I think this is what really drives young men to people like Fuentes, is that even among people who recognize that there are problems for young men on the right, they are not willing to approach young men on the right, young white men specifically, as a group in the same way that they would approach anyone else, um, and to really offer them the kinds of political concessions or attempts to build policy around their needs and desires in the same way that they would for women or for any particular minority group. And this makes young men and young white men very frustrated, and that really drives people out. So,
Um, so I think we're nearing the end. Did you have anything to add to that, Jude?
Uh, no, just a sort of general fulmination. This administration, Donald Trump came to power on the premise that the American dream is dead and that something has gone horribly wrong. And all that we have been offered in the time since is payoff checks and more bombing outside the United States. Someday a real storm is going to come. And I do not think that those who have been uncritically associated with the Trump movement are going to fare very well in this storm. I think that somebody who has a truly radical platform, a truly Leninist outlook in how to deal with these problems is going to be a serious force at some point in the next 15 years.
Man, a very ominous conclusion to today's podcast episode. But I can see your point. Let's go ahead and do our picks of the week. I'm going to pick the obituary of Dick Cheney that Dan McCarthy wrote for us last week. It's called The Failure Artist. The subhead is Dick Cheney sought to remake the world, and he did. Dan McCarthy's work is always good. He's an excellent writer. Cheney's passing was a big moment. It kind of signified the end of the war on terror era or the post 9/11 era in a lot of people's minds. So I was happy that we published one of the better obits on Dick Cheney on our site. Joseph, what's your pick of the week?
my pick will be J.D. Vance Can Lead a Post-Israel America by Andrew Day. This is a good piece talking about, how J.D. Vance has the capacity to sort of move forward in a productive fashion on this big schism in the right over Israel and U.S. policy towards Israel. So,
Jude.
I'm going to pick a piece of our generally excellent post-election coverage. Please go to our website and read all of it because it's all terrific. But I'm going to focus on one, which is Jim Antle, Tuesday's big winner, Gavin Newsom. He talks about the redistricting push that Andrew mentioned a little bit near the beginning of the podcast, and just sort of evaluates Newsom, who right now kind of looks like the Dauphin for the Democrats. He kind of looks like he's going to be the front runner in 28. Think that he is significantly more dangerous as a candidate than the Republicans are willing to credit right now. I think he's worth taking seriously. So, good place to start. Jim Antle, Tuesday's big winner, Gavin Newsom.
Yeah, it's interesting that Gavin Newsom has both taken this kind of resistance posture, willing to use very incendiary rhetoric to attack Trump, but also to reach out to kind of Trump aligned people. I think the first guest on his podcast was Charlie Kirk. I
Yeah, I
agree that
mean, it's
he's
very helpful not to believe anything.
hmm he's Machiavellian. I mean, I don't think that's just his kind of slick affect, that makes people think he's Machiavellian. I think he genuinely is. But that brings us to the end of this episode. I want to thank our listeners for listening until the end, and I want to thank you, Jude, and you, Joseph, for the illuminating discussion. See you next time.